Hello, and welcome to another webinar in fitness psychology. Today, we're going to be going over the keys to behavioral change. And so as of recording this right now, and I guess I'm dating it a little bit, but as of recording this right now, it is, of course, New Year's resolution season, but really any time of the year, we can be in a position where we want to change our behaviors or our habits in an attempt to better our life or ourselves in some ways. And so it's helpful to go over these keys to behavior change, knowing that they might be helpful to some folks right now, when their brain is already primed to try to make these decisions around improving their life, especially as we exit out of 2020 and into a new year. But that these same principles that we'll discuss today generalize to any time of the year, any situation where we want to try to make things a little bit better. As a reminder, again, I'm Julian.Frazier. I have a PhD in counseling psychology. I spend about half of my time, most of my time in a clinical practice in community mental health. And then I'm also an adjunct professor in counseling psychology. So got one foot in the domain of research and teaching and the other foot in a domain of practice, of clinical practice with folks. Also, in another life, I'm a personal trainer and health coach, certified through the American Council of Exercise. And so trying to bring all of these things together and under the big umbrella of what I'm calling fitness psychology. And hopefully these webinars help to touch on some of the topics which might be helpful and applicable to our lives right now. So without further ado, let's jump in. So this big screen of text is kind of looking at the psychology of behavioral change. And in particular, this big chunk in the middle, starting with classical and operant conditioning and then naming a bunch of different theories, is just to highlight that there are a number of different models and theories that we as psychologists use in our attempt to make sense of how behavior changes over time. You can see that it gets pretty messy pretty quickly, that there's a number of different theories that have been tested, that have empirical support. And I put etc. because these are just the ones that I'm aware of and that are on my radar when I'm making decisions around helping folks to change behaviors. And so knowing how many different models and theories that there are, it's probably safe to say that there is no definitive or silver bullet or panacea way that we go about making sense of behavior for each individual, that there's a number of different models and theories that we can use to guide how we go about making a plan for behavior change. But at the end of the day, that it's going to be different for each person. And so we're going to go over some keys today that I've distilled out from a variety of different practice, both with personal training and clinical practice and community mental health. Hopefully making it simple to grasp onto some topics that we might be able to add to our own lives. But that's just said, it's just look how complicated this is. I mean, in terms of individual techniques, there's a paper from 2013, which distills it out into like 93 different techniques plus, right? And that's not specific to one theory or to one framework of behavior change. So the science gets really deep into the weeds very quickly. And what would be helpful is a starting place. Now you can skip to the end and you can see the three keys that we outlined, the three words that start with P. And so there's some alliteration there, helps us remember it. But what we're going to do first, and it's kind of the meat of potatoes of this presentation, is actually to talk about what makes behavior change hard. What are the obstacles that we need to overcome? And once we've recognized the obstacles, then we'll see how those three keys really fit. And so if you want to skip ahead and skip to the end and see what those keys are or remind yourself, feel free. This is a free resource on the internet at this point. But what's going to be really helpful is if we understand what are the things that are keeping us from changing our behaviors, because it's likely if you have a New Year's resolution now that you've had one in the past, and it's likely if you've had a New Year's resolution in the past that it's fallen through the cracks by the time February and March roll around. And we might be thinking to ourselves, man, I really had a strong intention to change something up. So why wasn't I able to do that? Well, we're going to go over some of those obstacles first, and then we'll show how those keys kind of fit into the keyhole to potentially help us overcome those obstacles. So here's the 5 things that we're going to cover. Again, not the definitive list of things, but 5 things that really have stood out in terms of what I have experienced kind of clinically and in training and coaching and those sorts of things. And so the first one's likely one that you've heard of before. It's probably going to be the least interesting. It's habits and behavioral patterns and how we get into routines, right? Once we get into patterns, sometimes hard to break. So we'll talk about that. The second, we're going to talk about some biological imperatives. So there's some things that's happening inside of our body in terms of neurochemistry, in terms of hormones, in terms of our reactions to our environments, which kind of end up sinking us into certain patterns of behaviors and making other more creative ways of being less accessible. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about affect phobia, which boils down to the fear of feeling. And so when we try new things, sometimes I gave the example of a fear of failure. Sometimes it's uncomfortable to do things a new way. And so we find ourselves in a position where, so that we don't feel disappointed or don't feel let down or don't feel like a failure, we avoid new things altogether. We're going to talk about the intention behavior gap, which is something that is being researched as we speak, but has a few decades worth of inquiry so far, is kind of that gap between the psychological intention to do something and our actualization of that behavior. And then the last one is actually one that I made up. So hopefully that's more fun, is the compensatory compulsive response. And so you know that it's made up by me because it is by far the one that is the most difficult to say. And of course, psychologists are trying to make things as convoluted as possible. That's not the purpose. I'll explain the name later. So first and foremost, again, the one that you've likely heard of, there's some pretty good books out there in like the popular psychology genre, like The Power of Habit, which try to drive this point home. But there's the saying that goes like, things that fire together wire together, that when you do certain things, your brain becomes better at them. The more often I perform a behavior, the more automatic that it becomes. Right? And so I might wake up each morning and I might check this right here, my phone, which I can access my emails and social media and all those sorts of things. And if I do that each morning for a few different days in a row, then every morning that I wake up, I'll kind of have this feeling to check my phone. It becomes more automatic. In fact, I might find myself doing it without even thinking about it. There's a wide variety of different behavioral patterns and habits that we have developed over time. And so most of those are widely benign, right? Here's a funny example is every time that I walk into the bathroom, I tend to close the door, right? Because whatever I'm doing in the bathroom, I likely would prefer to have some privacy. Well, this was a behavioral pattern, which is probably fairly benign, right? In fact, it serves a pretty straightforward purpose. But the other day, the door to my bathroom broke, right? So when I turn the knob, the little plunger that allows the door to open and close no longer open and close. So when I closed the door, I was locked in my own bathroom. Now, I was able to like jimmy it open to break out of my own bathroom, essentially. But what was interesting was that later that same day, before maintenance had come to fix my door, and I was thinking to myself, okay, can't close the door because even if it's on the outside or inside, it can't open up again. There was a time where I walked into the bathroom. And of course, automatically, without thinking, I closed the door and I locked myself in the bathroom again. And so you can imagine being an intellectual is like, I'm smart and I know that I just have to be mindful about this thing, has the almost self-embarrassment of locking myself in my own bathroom twice because of a habit of closing a door whenever I walk in. So a generally benign habit that I have, that I'm sure a lot of people have. And then this situation was brought to light for me. And so what our brain does is, in an effort to be efficient, is it combines a number of different behaviors, which we tend to do in the same order. And so I might go into my car, I might put on my seatbelt, key in ignition, turn on. There's a number of different behaviors, but they've all kind of linked together to be performed in a way that is almost kind of subconsciously automatic, right? These are the kinds of things which, when we were first learning how to drive, we were trying to be very conscientious of, and now they're pretty automatic. I might also have a pretty automatic way about how I had my commute to work. Now, right now, I'm working from home mostly. But I can definitely recall in my mind the commute to work every day. And so it might be that from the moment I step out of my house and pat my pockets to make sure that I have everything for the day, that when I get in my car, seatbelt on, key in ignition turned on, that the entire route to work is more or less automatic, right? And you'll see people doing their makeup, texting in the car, eating breakfast, all these other things, which, to be honest, it's because our brain has freed up enough resources by making those patterns and habits automatic that we have the capacity to do all these other things, which are otherwise really distracting. I wouldn't encourage anyone to eat breakfast and do your makeup and text while driving, but it's just a testament to how effective our brain is at linking behaviors together to make patterns or habits. Right? And so I like to think of it like digging out a trough of or a riverbed, right? Is that the more water runs through the river, the more the riverbed is cemented. It gets deeper and deeper and deeper. So every time it rains or water comes through that area, the water tends to go down a certain path. Right? And so it's very difficult for the water to decide to go down a different path because, of course, it flows down the same flow of the riverbed every time, right? I would have to go out of my way to, build a dam or to dig out an entirely different trough in order to encourage the water to go different ways. But once that riverbed is dug out, the water will return to that riverbed each time. And so this is one thing that makes new behaviors very difficult because it feels as though behaviors have an inertia, right? They have momentum behind them. And let's say I pushed a big rock down a hill. Well, it's going to take some energy to push that rock to get it going, but it's going to take much more energy once that ball has some momentum to slow it down, right? Because it has inertia, it has an energy behind it. And so once our behavior patterns are carved out, it takes a lot of energy to carve them a different direction or to influence them a different direction because they have a momentum, they have an inertia as a way of thinking about it. In this way, new behaviors kind of have to compete with the old ones. So if I was going to choose a different way of going to work, for example, let's say some days I take the highway, some days I choose to take the byways or just the normal streets. There's definitely been days where I have had the intention of taking the normal streets to work, maybe because the highway felt packed to me or too congested. And while I was daydreaming about something else, I automatically got onto the highway. I just watched myself make this decision. And it's because those behavioral patterns are already so carved out that I have to be really intentional about having new behaviors or more novel behaviors. And so this is the most basic thing that we can think of in terms of a lot of people having difficulty with having new behaviors, is that your new behaviors, the ones that might be in your best interest, have to compete with the ones that already have a lot of inertia, that are already well carved out. And so you'll find that these 5 things have more that kind of overlap than they are distinct ideas, but there's just a lot of different ways that we can think about making sense of, man, why is behavior change so difficult for us? And one of those pieces is kind of like a biological imperative. And so the reason that our brain puts together habits and patterns and routines for us is because it wants to be efficient, wants to be opportunistic, and it's motivated by reward. And so if I can operationalize or make all of those boring tasks, like putting a seatbelt on, key in ignition, etc., efficient by making them automatic, then I can expend energy in other places. And so what we can think about is that some things are, of course, more rewarding than others. That, for example, chocolate cake is something which is likely more rewarding than, say, a stick of celery, right? Is that when we have cravings, it's not often that we find ourselves craving celery, but we might crave something that is more robust in terms of flavor, something that is a little more fat or a little more salt or a little bit more sweet or some combination, right? And so because we're motivated by reward and opportunistic thinking, it means that things which are more convenient, which are cheaper, and of course, which are more robust in terms of flavor or reward are going to carve out that riverbed faster, right? And so a lot of folks know this, right? When they're marketing to you, is that they want to get you in the door just once, because just one time going to a new establishment, if you really enjoy it, will start to carve out that riverbed a lot faster towards the creation of new behaviors. Problem is that a lot of the behaviors which are in our best interests, a lot of the new behaviors we want to instill aren't as rewarding, aren't as opportunistic as the ones which we might already have. What I mean by that is, and I give this example of the strawberry and the Oreo, right? That our brain, if you've had an Oreo, likely when it's craving something sweet, it's more likely to think about that Oreo, unless you just genuinely don't like Oreos, than it is a strawberry, right? Because they're both sweet, they're both pleasurable experiences. But our brain, if what we really want is something that's sweet and rewarding, then we can likely get a whole package of Oreos. And in some cases, for less money than a package of organic strawberries, for example, even if we know that one is better than the other. In this case, having a new behavior means choosing the less rewarding, less cheap, less convenient option. And so that works against our biology. That works against the ways that our brain naturally functions. We'll see how that causes some issues later on. But part of that biological imperative is also how our states change over time. And so if I'm stressed out, if I'm in that fight or flight mode, so much of my energy is going towards this survival imperative that there's less energy for coming up with creative or novel solutions to problems, that I might need to be mindful in order to make good decisions. But if all of my energy is going away from my good decisions and going towards survival, then I might find myself going back to old habits, right? And so we'll find that if our emotional state is elevated, and this can be like elevated in really negative ways, but elevated in very positive ways as well. I think there's a joke around football that people, whether their team wins or loses, they end up going out and having an extra drink, right? Because if their team loses, then they have a drink in order to like soothe, the loss. But if they win, then they go out and have a drink to celebrate, right? So strong, elevated emotional states tend towards pre-existing behaviors, old behaviors, patterns that we had before. And so there's a lot of biology that's going on in here. And it's one thing that's really important from my perspective as someone who works clinically is, acknowledging and validating that there are some benefits to things staying the same. That, I might encourage that someone eat less fast food. And also I recognize that maybe based off of your budget, maybe you got 3 kids that you have to feed and you're already working 2 jobs and the things that you don't have are time and money. And so an option is like, well, I can buy organic stuff and like feed half of my family, or I can get fast food and at least I'll have a little bit more time to myself and I'll be able to feed everyone, right? There are some benefits to things staying the same. Sometimes those benefits are just doing things differently is going to have to make me different than the people that I hang out with. That my friends tend to do things a certain way. And if I'm going to decide to do things differently, it's going to make me different than my friends. Like if we're all going out to eat and I'm trying to eat healthy or be vegan or eat, anything, is I'm going to have to tell the people in my friend group that I'm doing something differently than them, right? And that might create enough tension or distance to dissuade some individuals, that idea of back in the 90s of peer pressure, right? From changing their behaviors. And so acknowledging that, there's likely some things about staying the same that is working, that's still helpful, that there are, and the pros and cons list, that there are likely some pros to not changing old behaviors. We talked to you about affect phobia, and we started talking a little bit about how heightened emotions impairs our ability to come up with creative solutions to novel problems. And so part of that is also this kind of meta idea of the fear of feeling. And sometimes that can be the fear of fear itself, nothing to fear, but fear itself, fear of failure, right? Sometimes this is an interesting thing what happens, especially for high performers. And so for high performers is that they likely do their job very well. And so they get a lot of positive feedback for doing their job really well. And so if that high performer tries something new, maybe they don't do it as well as when they do the thing that they are an expert at. And so they don't get as much positive feedback from doing the new thing as from just doing the thing that they're already an expert at. And so this lack of positive feedback, this in social media terms is less likes, less views, right? Less comments, right? Having less positive feedback leaves us kind of feeling like, I tried this new thing and, I didn't get nearly as much positive feedback as when I just did the thing that I used to do all the time. What we'll find is that this is a kind of affect phobia, where it's kind of a fear of disappointment, a fear of not having that positive feedback from others, and can be a thing which dissuades us from trying new things. And oftentimes, of course, changing behavior means trying new things. This is, again, a powerful driver when what's in our best interest does not initially feel good. And so for a lot of folks who are trying to get in shape, and I will use exercise as an idea more and more often throughout the rest of this PowerPoint, but is that exercise at first is tiring. I might have to go to a gym or a space where there's people who are more fit than me and I don't feel comfortable. I'm sweaty, I'm breathing heavy. All of these things may not feel great at the beginning. And so we might fear that feeling of uncomfortability at the beginning so much that we avoid that piece altogether. And most of what feels good about exercise is after a few weeks. And we might actually experience some of that improvement in endorphins and endocannabinoids and all kinds of things after we have that uncomfortable session, right? After, or that feeling of reward or response that I was able to do a hard thing, right? But we don't get to that point because we avoid the uncomfortability on the front end, right? And so this is a number of different ways which affect phobia, kind of this fear of feeling or avoidance of feeling can lead to us distancing ourselves from positive behaviors. And so this is one that I'm actually most interested in right now, which is really interesting to me, is this idea of the intention behavior gap. And one piece of literature, and I'm blanking on the piece. If you want it, I'll put it in the comment section. But what it said is that it's about 40, 50-ish% of our positive intentions actually become behaviors, which shakes out to me that every time that you have an intention to do something good, it's more or less a coin flip whether or not you'll actually do that thing. And so what happens is a number of people, especially coming into a new year, or maybe they're just caffeinated that day, or they're just feeling inspired or motivated, they have a strong intention to do something. I intend to go to the gym, right? And they will have that strong and genuine intention. Like if anyone told you or asked you, like, hey, do you want to go to the gym? You'd be like, absolutely, man, this is definitely what I want to do. My mind's made up. All the way up until the point where they have to make the decision to actually go to the gym. And then something happens. There's like this vast psychological landscape. And that intention is never actualized. And so we're thinking like, what is this gap between our thoughts and our behaviors that it's difficult to consistently bridge that gap? And so that's what a lot of folks are looking at in terms of the intention behavior gap, is that we would think that intentions alone would predict behavior, but it turns out that's not quite the case. And so I can think of that that experience of genuinely wanting to do a positive thing as being a state of intention. And I like this play on words here. It's not the exact origin of the word, but is being in tension, right? I'm in a state of tension, which I might think of like as potential energy for my physics nerds out there, right? So again, that's that idea of having a rock sitting on top of a hill, and it has a lot of potential energy. And behavior is when that potential energy transitions to kinetic energy. So that rock is not just sitting on top of the hill, it's rolling down it, right? And so we can kind of see how there's some parallels that when we're in a state of tension, it's a positive tension state because we have a strong psychological intention to do a thing. But boy, does it take a lot to push that boulder to get it moving down the hill. This is actually probably an adaptive quality. And let me explain how it's adaptive for us to have a gap between our intention and behaviors. Well, imagine that we had intentions throughout the day, as many of us do. We think of ideas, think of things we should do, and we didn't procrastinate on any of them. That any good idea that popped into our mind, we immediately did, right? Immediately started taking action on. Well, number one, it would be very difficult for us to stay on one task for too long, right? Because I have like, oh, I have a really good idea. And I immediately start it. And who knows, I could start that task and then I'd have another good idea. And then I would start something completely different. These people would be bouncing around. My attention would be pulled in so many different directions. But I also might do things that are really high risk. I might have things which optimistically sound like good ideas, which actually aren't that good ideas at all. And so we'll might see folks with like ADHD or experiencing symptoms of mania or other things which shorten this intention behavior gap. They seem to jump from one thing to the next, like popcorn kernels popping, right? It's really difficult for us to stay with one thing. And so having enough of an intention behavior gap to be able to think through a good intention that you have might actually prepare you for when you do actually take the action or behavior, that you're well prepared. This same intention behavior gap, however, when it's too wide, it keeps us from engaging in new activities in general, right? And so there seems to be a sweet spot where the intention behavior gap is just wide enough that it allows us to vet new ideas and to think things through. Is that really a good idea? Is that really a good use of my time? But not so wide that we have tons of intentions and we take action on none of them. We kind of sit around daydreaming about all the things that we want to do, but never seem to follow through or finish any of them. So it can be both a barrier, and in some ways it's helpful to have this, but recognize that it serves as an obstacle for a lot of folks, especially this time of year. Last but not least, in terms of obstacles for us, is what we call the compensatory compulsive response. And by we, I mean me. And so I will have the caveat that this is both conceptual and theoretical, in that it's kind of based off of some of the science that I've seen and also my own musings. If you wanted to, you can skip this slide entirely and be like, it's just Julian making things up, which I am occasionally prone to do. But the idea is that, as we've talked about before, so much of changing behaviors goes counter to our biological imperatives. I have to really use my frontal lobes here and a lot of executive functioning. I have to make a lot of decisions. I have to flex that free will, so to speak, in order to work against, the things that are more rewarding, or against the things that are more convenient, or against the things which are cheaper in the long run. That's difficult for our brain to do. And so our brain says, if I can't trust my feelings or my intuitions, if I can't trust my cravings, right, then what can I trust? How do I go about making these decisions, right? And we might try to over rationalize this process or to intellectualize it into a number of what we call heuristics, right? Rules of thumb. Right? And so especially when it comes to food, there's a lot of heuristics. There's a lot of ideas, and different diets and different fads have ideas of which foods are good, which foods are bad, which foods are neutral, right? We go that is a kind of heuristic, a moralizing heuristic, because the moral is whether something is good or bad. And so what's interesting is, since our brain says, okay, I can't rely on my emotions, can't rely on my impulses or my intuition, because my intuition would have me eating cake a lot more often than is probably good for me. So I'll have to rely on something else, and then I can kind of think of all of these rational or intellectual rules or heuristics to apply to the world in order to help myself achieve the goals that I want. And so a lot of programs and products buy into this idea by selling you rules of thumb. They sell you what's good or bad. They sell you what you can and cannot do. The problem is that a lot of these heuristics are oversimplified, or they're reductionistic. They think about broad populations of people without looking at the individual person, right? They'll take a tiny bit of evidence and then they'll extrapolate it to mean that everyone should do this thing, right? The problem is, and who knows, they might actually not be doing that, but the way that it's marketed makes it seem that way. So if you kind of dug a little bit deeper into like a paleo diet or something, you might see that there is room for nuance or context there, but that's kind of lost on the surface level when it's marketed as a caveman diet, for example. So something is lost in translation. That leads to a process of what we call cognitive distortions, right? And so that's the process of shoulding, right? There's this idea that there's some things I should do and there's some things I shouldn't do. That's all or nothing thinking, right? It's like either I'm entirely on my diet or I've broken my diet and it's out the window, right? Or this idea of perfectionism, right? That I would rather not eat at all than to eat something which is unhealthy, right? These are all my attempts to follow the rules of thumbs that have been sold to me by different programs and packages. And sometimes those are, social cultural narratives that have been passed down to me about what's good for me and what's bad for me. But my attempts to follow those rules of thumb lead to these distorted ways of thinking. Again, I've said, okay, I can't worry about my emotions, can't worry about my intuitions. So I'll have to focus on the rules. And my attempts to focus on the rules becomes distorted a little bit, right? It takes out the room for nuance. It takes out the room for me and my lifestyle. It takes out all of the context and boils things down into heuristics. Unfortunately, these kinds of things can erode our mental health. And so we'll see for example, with diets, eating disorders, where folks stick to a certain regimen that is restrictive, but they're trying to follow the rules of a certain diet, right? And in doing so, they're restricting something. And by restriction, I mean they're not giving their body everything that they need. And so their physical health erodes, but their mental health is also eroding because there's this divide between what they want and what they crave and what they need and what this rational idea or rule system is telling them. Right? And so internally, there's turmoil. Physically, there's turmoil. And all of this coming from a positive intention, again, to do something good for yourself. Right? We have a good intention and a negative consequence. And so that's where the name comes from. And thanks for entertaining this whole idea, is that it's compensatory. We are compensating for the fact that we have to go counterintuitive to our biological imperatives. And then there's this idea of the compulsive response. So there's a compulsive response as a result of having to compensate. This means that sometimes our attempts to apply rules in rigid ways leads to negative outcomes. Of course, if it's not sustainable, then even the things that work in the short term might have long-term consequences, which undermines our attempts at change. So if that didn't make any sense, if that's confusing and probably not helpful, then again, feel free to package it up and throw it out the window, because this is an idea that my brain's kind of cooked together. And I don't just want to give you the things that already exist. I want to try to give you some things that are also like almost philosophical in my own musings. So you can kind of get a look at where my brain is at too, but take it or leave it. If it's helpful, you can think of it as like, wow, there have been times where I have tried to do good things and the outcomes or consequences of those good things, while unintended, did in fact lead to me stopping. Right? Okay, so we have these 5 aspects: habits, behavioral patterns, biological imperatives, affect phobia, this intention behavior gap, and the CCR. How do we overcome these 3 things? And so you see it right there at the bottom of the screen. There's going to be 3 keys that we're going to talk about today. And if you skipped right back to this point, then those 3 keys are prime, practice, and play. 3 P words. Alliteration makes it easier to remember. 3 chunks of information. And we're going to talk about each of them now. We've talked about the solution, the obstacles, the barriers. Now we're going to talk about possible solutions. So the first is to prime. We want to try to prime a new behavior or a new environment. And so priming your environment helps to facilitate change. I'll explain exactly what that means. I had a client, and this was actually pretty recently, who also wanted to incorporate exercise into their life. Now, they might have clinically been what we would describe as morbidly obese based off of their BMI. And so that's a clinical term. That's not a judgment. And they want to lose some weight for the sake of their own health, for knee pain, back pain, those sorts of things. I'm like, great, let's do that. Right? And we also know that there's pretty good evidence that incorporating exercise and movement in sedentary individuals helps to abate depression and anxiety, which he was also coping with. So I can kind of justify bringing that into my clinical work. And so for him, he wanted to start, and he already took the steps of going online and looking up exercise regimens, which had like a number of different progressions, things that he could do given his level of function. I was like, that's great. How do I help you to start doing those things? He's like, well, I don't have a lot of space, right? I can't go to the gym right now. I wouldn't want to. I have my room, but the rest of the house is really packed. There's my cousin and her kids, and a lot of constraints in his environment. Okay, and I said, so if you were to do it, you would do it in your room. He's like, yeah, I would do it in my room. He looked around and he's like, well, there's not a whole lot of space here. I could figure it out, but it's like, okay. Well, what if we were to do 1 push-up right now? Would we be able to do it? And he looks around and says, well, it's kind of messy around here. And so we took a step back and said, okay, what's on the floor right now? So you would do a push-up, you'd likely do on the floor. What's on the floor? And he named a few articles of clothing. And I was like, okay, let's move the pants from the floor. And he kind of looks at me. And of course, this is under the context that we're doing remote care. So I actually have an opportunity to be in his bedroom with him during a session. And he gets really upset. Right? The inertia of just taking the first step forward was really upsetting for him. And he's like, why am I this way? That the idea of moving pants off of my floor is upsetting. Right? And I tried to be encouraging and say, look, all you have to do is move your pants off your floor. So we worked through that. He picks his pants up his floor. And he's actually gone for a little bit while longer than I would imagine. And he comes back and he says, okay, I've cleaned my room. It's like, oh, okay. So we were set out to take 1 step to move your pants off the floor. And you cleaned the whole room. Awesome. Now we have space for a push-up, right? That first step, taking pants off the floor, is not what most people think of when they think of starting an exercise regimen, right? But for this individual, they needed to be able to take the tiniest, easiest step forward. And in doing so, they were priming their environment to make it possible, because otherwise having a messy room would have always been enough of an excuse to stop him from working out. Well, once he cleaned his room, he did 1 push-up. Said that was kind of hard. Showed him a variation of the push-up that he could do against the wall. Said that one I can do. Has been doing that since, right? And it started with moving pants off of the floor. And so that's kind of an example of how we might go about priming our environment, that it does feel good to be able to condition things in such a way that we facilitate our behavior change. Now, even if he didn't go about the exercise program, we would make sure that we would clean the room regularly enough so that the space he was in was as facilitatory of taking that step as possible, removing as many barriers as possible. So if you want to go to the gym, maybe that first step is having a gym membership or knowing where you're going or knowing which gym you're going to. But we can also do something as simple as, sitting out our gym clothes the day before, putting our shoes by the door, right? Making sure we got a protein shake in the refrigerator. We're setting all of these things in motion to be able to facilitate behavior change. And even if we don't go to the gym tomorrow, we still have the clothes set out, we still have the shoes by the door, we still have protein shake. Each day improves the odds that we'll be able to take that first step. And so I have the ideas of, taking the most confident action. I'll ask people, you have a goal for this week. What would be a 10 out of 10 in confidence? It's like, well, I think I can work out 3 times a week. I'm 10 out of 10 confident. I'm like, cool. We'll make our goal 2 times a week. You're 10 out of 10 confident that you can do it 3 times a week. We're going to make our goal 2 times a week. And if you do more than that, it's bonus points. We might take the easiest first step, right? We might moving the pants off the floor is the easiest first step. And then we might find ourselves doing more than that because we're driven by, we've made the tiniest bit of progress. That felt good. What's the next step of progress? Well, I could clean my whole room, right? We can remove environmental barriers and try to condition our environment. And so that might be that if I know that I'm prone to snacking, then I don't keep certain snacks in my house. It's a lot more difficult to snack on potato chips if I don't have the bag in my house, right? I might keep an alternative to that, but I'm conditioning my environment to dissuade me from certain behaviors. This one is fun and a little counterintuitive, is thinking as little as possible, right? And so that might be taking things one step at a time, but the more that we have to think about, the more we're loading that intention, and the less likely it is that it will translate to behavior. And so if I'm thinking about not just how I'm going to exercise or what I'm going to do at the gym, but the program I'm going to follow and how often and how many reps and what weight. And if I'm trying to engineer all of these things without experience, especially, I'm going to dissuade myself. There's going to feel like there's too much that I have to know in order to take action. And so I encourage people to think as little as possible. What is the thing you can do that is going to require you to do the least problem solving mentally? And let's start there and then move on. If we have to do some social priming, which means we hire a trainer, a coach, a professional, we go online and see people model it on YouTube or something like that, then that's something that we can do as well. Let's let the professionals do the thinking for us, right? Let's delegate that piece so that we can set ourselves up for success. And, as our brain makes sense of all those other things, we can take more and more autonomy, but we want to make sure that we're priming ourselves and our environment for success. Again, it might not happen the first day or the second day, but if every single day we are doing something to prime our environment, then eventually the odds will be in our favor that we will have kind of a breakthrough with our behaviors. So sometimes it's just creating the environment for eventual positive behavior change. Second piece of that, second key, is deliberate practice. And so I think a lot of folks who are performance-based, skill-based, they're kind of familiar with this idea of deliberate practice, which is having a clear a goal or intention, and then having a progression of steps to accomplish that goal, right? Usually deliberate practice involves some level of immediate feedback. So I do a thing, there's some mechanism that gives me some feedback as to whether or not that thing works, and I can make meaning of the progress from where I've been before to where I'm going. And so I will again use an example of the gym, is that a lot of things you can do in the gym, there is very little feedback for. right? I can get on a bike or a treadmill or something like that and run on it. Indefinitely, not a whole lot of feedback. It's giving me some numbers in terms of theoretical calories that I've burned and those sorts of things. But other than that, I don't know how I've gotten better. I might make sense over progress over time in terms of maybe number of minutes that I've run or the distance that I've apparently run. But there's not that aspect of mastery in terms of how I have a clear goal that I'm getting some immediate feedback on. Right? And so unless you are in fact a long distance runner and you are measuring things out in miles or time. One thing that I can definitely think about is that there's a lot of compound movements like the squat or the deadlift or a number of other things that are in the gym, which require pretty relatively technical movements, right? And so I might think of a progression leading up to someone doing a squat as we don't have any weight at all. And we just go over the movement itself and we kind of get an idea where our feet are in relation to our shoulders and where our knees, they don't bow in, but they stay together and our back has stayed in a pretty active posture. I might go through all of these different learning cues, taking one at a time. And I might have folks practice that and I'll give them feedback immediately. It's like, okay, that time when you did it, it was great. And also I noticed that our knees went way out to the sides whenever we did it. Let's try to keep our knees in the same place and move from our hips instead. We're kind of holding that hinge at the hips, right? That immediate feedback allows us to correct things in real time. And thus, while we're working towards a certain goal, taking it one learning cue at a time, we can find a way to improve ourselves much faster than another process of trial and error. And so a lot of folks, when they start to try something new, they come into it with a trial and error mentality. And when we're not working with deliberate practice, that means that, those failures it may be difficult for us to distill out the lessons from the failures. So the failures just feel bad. We know that something went wrong, but we don't really know how to correct it. And that leads to more trial and error. And so over time, those errors or those perceived failures kind of feel like a weight on our back. Sometimes if it's physically a weight on your back, then those trial and errors can lead to injury or overtraining or those sorts of things. And so while we do want to, on one hand, customize a situation to be just for you, we also want to have that piece of deliberate practice. Even now with PhD and working clinically, we're supervised. That we have a kind of a chain of command where we meet with folks pretty weekly, talk about cases, talk about, the conceptualization of clients and diagnosis and what we tried and if it worked or didn't work. And we'd have that process, that back and forth of deliberate practice. And so finding ways of whatever you're doing, being deliberate about it, trying to be a little bit more intentional than trial and error is one way that we can facilitate, overcome some of these obstacles. Again, if it's too much thought in our own mind of how to do that, it's always worthwhile to consult with an expert in whatever it is that you're trying to do, to talk to someone who can develop a program for you and provide clear feedback for you. This little piece here at the bottom, I don't want to forget, is that it's interesting that many of the tenets for deliberate practice are also some of the researched antecedents of the flow state. So flow state is this like state of optimal performance when everything is going really well, when you put the squat rack on your back, or the bar, I should say, not the whole squat rack, the bar on your back, and you do a squat and it's really good form and everything looks fine, felt fine. It was pretty great. In fact, you're excited to do more of them because you were lifting more weight than you were allowed. All of these pieces of positive reinforcement coming together, kind of that flow state. Well, it turns out having clear goals and intentions, getting immediate feedback, making meaningful steps out of the progress, having progressions, all of these pieces are antecedents, environmental factors, if we will, that facilitate the flow state. So deliberate practice is great on the front end in terms of adopting new skills, at least generally more successful than the process of trial and error. And it also, once we have developed some mastery and skill, facilitates the flow state, this process of positive experience through doing these things. And so all positive reasons to begin to have some deliberate practice in what we do. Last but not least, thanks for sticking with me so far. This is probably one of my favorite, is the psychology of play. That of course we need to prime, we need to practice, but we absolutely need to play. And the reason why this is so important is because oftentimes we are dissuaded by failure and error, right? That affect phobia. But remember the last time that you were playing, you had some goals, kind of, you were deciding the goals on the fly. There were some things which were kind of fluid, and you were kind of creating it, putting it together, and you tried something and it didn't work, but you got some ideas, right? The process of play normalizes failure as like a part of the creative process. It's almost celebrated. I'll give you an example of fairly recently. I was, and I'm an adult here, playing with Nerf guns. And so there's these plastic guns that shoot these little foam bullets at a gym, and we would move things around. And okay, this is a parkour gym, so it's easier to move things around than say at a traditional lifting gym. But what was so fun about it is that we didn't really have a template. We didn't really have, we knew that if you got shot that you were out. And then we kind of figured out the rules and all those things as we went along. And we ended up having a really fun time. In fact, so much fun that I probably did more cardio over the course of figuring out how we're going to play Nerf guns than I would have normally if I were to go to a gym or do treadmill or any other thing. And so that process of play, it facilitated movement and activity. It was present centered. We were handling one aspect of that creative process at a time. It was process oriented. We weren't really worried about the outcome or the goal necessarily, but we were, really in the process. That the fun part was the creating of it together, right? That's something that we do all the time as children, and for whatever reason is conditioned out of us as adults, but is a critical part of continued human development. And so when we do think about affect phobia, when we do think about all those things which don't feel good, when there's a certain standard that we feel like we need to meet but can't, right? Play is great for breaking that down, for deconstructing all of these notions that we have to be perfect, and rather we can just find ways of being inventive and creative, right? So these are very lofty sort of positive psychology ideas. And in some ways you can think that, well, wait a second, didn't you just say with deliberate practice that I need to have clear intentions and goals? And now you're saying with play, I need to be unstructured and just creative and just put things together. And you're absolutely right. There needs to be room for both of them. And that's why for a lot of folks, they go one route or the other. It's either full play, full creativity, no boundaries, no clear goals, kind of vague, doesn't really know when it starts or ends. It's enjoyable and fun, but doesn't really lead anywhere. Or they go full deliberate practice where they have a program and they have a regimen and they stick to it and they're really fine tuning and focused, right? But there's no room for customization or creativity, right? Or no individualization. Like my body is different than your body. So we might be doing a similar motion, but what's going to work for me is going to work different for you, for example. That is why we should be considering creating some intentional time for play. So if there's something that you're doing that's fun, and the gym is a difficult example just because of the kind of environment that it is. But, I've been to rock climbing gyms, martial arts gyms, right? There's times where we have the lesson, and then there's open gym. There's free time where you just look at a wall and see how you can scurry up it. And then maybe that was fun. So you're trying to figure out a different way to get up the same wall, or you have your class of martial arts and then you just spend some time just wailing away at the bag, right? The point is that with deliberate practice and play, we both have room for the piece where we are fine-tuning and refining through the process of getting feedback, and also have space for this creative process so that I can take what I'm learning through deliberate practice and make it my own. I can make it personal to me. And once it is individualized, I'm much more likely to continue it than if I were just copying, pasting the ideas of a certain program or idea or concept and trying to fit some other mold, right? And so those three things, first the process of priming, then the process of deliberate practice, having some intentional means by which we're getting immediate feedback, and finally, having some intentional time for play, are all things which can help to break down the barriers of the 5 things that we had listed before, that they can help to moderate that intention behavior gap, right? They can help to break down those rigid rules around what we should or shouldn't do, because there's some rules for play when we're allowed to play with those rules, right? It helps to break down affect phobia, this idea that I don't have to worry about failure because what I'm doing is analogous to, it doesn't really have an outcome, it's just kind of this process that I think is kind of fun and I'm driven by. And hey, I happen to get a really good workout running around shooting Nerf guns with my friends. I encourage you to look at these 3 keys as part of a set, maybe, that there's likely other things which can be keys to behavior change, to facilitating our moving forward with finding a better alternative to some of the patterns and habits that we have. Maybe there's something like self-actualization waiting on the other side of a number of different doors. And now we just have 3 keys that we can try at each of these doors to see if they unlock. And so that is all I have for you today. There's 3 keys from fitness psychology around behavior change. We've gone over some of the obstacles and potential barriers. I looked at both the positives and negatives of some of those, and came up with 3 Ps that are easy to remember that you can start incorporating into your changes right now. So I encourage you to do that. If you have any questions from me, feel free to reach out. I think that I will continue to put contact information into the description of each of these for as long as that seems feasible and fair and safe. And I hope to continue with these every week. Now, if my own New Year's resolution is to do one of these every week for the whole year, then that means that I have 52 videos approximately to make, which also means that I likely need ideas for 52 videos. So I think I have ideas for like 10, and then I have an issue. So if you have any ideas of things that you would like to be, that you would like to see covered from the fitness psychology background or from my own clinical practice or from my academic work or anything, why don't you send them to me or include them in a comment, because I will actually be paying attention to those as I'm brainstorming what I want to do next. So if you want to have an impact on what this looks like in the future, that's one fun way of doing it. I have been Julian.Frazier, PhD in counseling psychology, and I'll see you in the next episode. Who knows what we'll cover? I don't know yet myself. So maybe it will be one of your comments. All right. Have a good day.